I'm Jonathan Tame, the director of the Jubilee Centre, and welcome to this event, our Cambridge Papers live event, which we try and run every quarter following the publication of our Cambridge Papers. So today what we are looking at is this paper, or a talk based on this paper called After the Virus, Is It Time for a Debt Jubilee? I hope many, if not all of you, have had a chance to look at it beforehand, although Paul is going to give an overview and summary of the paper in the next 20 minutes, 25 minutes, after which we'll be able to have a conversation about it. So my colleague Mercedes is in the chat function, and she's going to be encouraging you to put your questions into the chat, and then I'll be able to draw them out appropriately when the Q&A begins. So we've given almost half of the event over to discussion and questions. So please don't hold back. Write your question into the chat, whatever you'd like to ask Paul. It's a great privilege then to welcome Paul to this event. Paul's been involved with the Jubilee Centre for 30 years now, and has been a crucial member of our Cambridge Papers writing group, editorial group. He studied at Cambridge University in economics. He got his PhD on debt finance and the biblical ban on interest. And he's worked professionally for HM Treasury, where he was involved in issuing the UK government debt bonds. And then he's had senior roles in the IMF in Washington and more recently in London. He's based in London, is an elder of a Baptist church, and has brought together through his life his love for the Bible and his professional expertise around finance and debt, and is, I think, one of the most qualified people globally really to bring together these two issues. How do we think biblically about debt, debt forgiveness, the idea of Jubilee, and so on? So without any further ado, let me welcome and hand over to Paul Mills.
Thank you, Jonathan. As we've just said, I'll run briefly through the paper and then we'll have questions about it. I'll start sharing my screen shortly for the slides. Just by way of introduction, it's worth stressing that after the great financial crisis, there were a few suggestions for debt restructuring, debt relief, debt jubilees. A few analysts coined that phrase and used that to advocate debt reductions then. Since that time, over the past decade, debts across the world and across sectors, that's governments, companies, households, and financial institutions, have all been rising sharply. So even before the virus struck last year, there were calls for we need a systemic debt restructuring because it's having a big impact on slowing down the world economy and producing injustices in various places. But those calls have been magnified by the virus and the policy response to it. So I'm just going to start sharing the screen and show you my slides. And so just to note that now with the policy response to the virus, including lockdowns, these have been unprecedented. This has not been the playbook for how you do pandemics in the past, but governments have chosen effectively to shut down their economies, particularly in higher income countries. And that's produced a big impact both on the size of economies. So GDP has shrunk, but also various sectors have had to borrow a lot more as a result. So particularly governments have been involved heavily in fiscal stimulus, tax cuts, loan guarantees to the private sector. Lower income households have been affected by unemployment and wage cuts, sometimes say on furlough schemes. I put HIPCs, that's heavily indebted countries, that poorer countries. So the effect of the slowdown in the global economy has been particularly hard on the poorest countries, and that's been flagged up by the World Bank and the UN. And of course, corporates, there was a big rise in corporate debt prior to this crisis, particularly in the US and the UK. But particular corporate sectors have been very hard hit by lockdowns, particularly retail, tourism, and travel. And so we come into this lockdown period, economic slowdown, at very high debt levels historically, but now they've gone up even more. Debts have grown roughly 10 to 15% across the globe, but income has shrunk by 10 to 15% in many countries. And so you've got this big increase in debt, reduction in ability to pay for it, and that's prompted these ideas of should debts be relieved or cancelled. And we've reached, particularly some Christians have reached for the biblical terminology of jubilees or debt cancellations. So that was the motivation for the Cambridge paper, and to come up with the idea of what is the biblically informed response to these thoughts. Moving on, we'll just briefly review what the Bible says about debts and debt cancellation. This is primarily drawn initially from Old Testament law, and I'm going to quote Deuteronomy 15 shortly, but we have to remember that the law is a relational paradigm. It's trying to seek just, fair, merciful, loving relationships within a wider society. And that was initially the people of God, Israel, in the land that God had chosen. And then the New Testament broadens that under Jesus' teachings to the church, and then wider to our neighbor. The ideal in the Old Testament law is of interest-free lending. There's prohibitions on interest, but debts need to be repaid. A debt is a promise. There is a moral duty to keep one's promises, just as God does, keeps his word. So within that framework, then Deuteronomy 15 in particular sets out this idea that every 7 years, there would be a period where debts would be cancelled, and debt serfs or debt servants would be released. That's most explicitly in Deuteronomy 15, 1 and 2. But it's referred to later, particularly by Jeremiah in Jeremiah 34. God condemns the king of Israel at the time, the king of Jerusalem, for not cancelling the debts and reneging his promise to do so. And then Nehemiah, after the exile, restores the cancellation of debt after the exile. I'll just read Deuteronomy 15, 1 and 2 first. At the end of every 7 years, you must cancel debts. This is how it is to be done. Every creditor shall cancel any loan that they have made to a fellow Israelite. They shall not require payment from anyone among their own people, because the Lord's time for cancelling debts has been proclaimed. This only applied to those within Israel. Debts owed by foreigners did not have to be cancelled, just as interest could be charged to foreigners as well. So there's this very clear distinction in the law between the community of Israel and the residents, even resident aliens within Israel, and those outside, those deemed foreigners. This year of debt cancellation was distinct from the Jubilee. So the Jubilee occurred every 7 times 7 years, and that involved the release of land that had been leased since the last Jubilee, and the release of Israelite servants, and the going back to the land of families whose land it had originally been given to. So Even I used the idea of debt jubilee in the title of the paper because that's the catchy title. But just to be very clear, debt cancellation is specifically a 7-year institution in Deuteronomy 15. The jubilee occurs every 7 times 7 years. And so if you think that this is a part of the Sabbath day 7 number pattern that occurs within the law. First of all, you have the Sabbath on the 7th day of the week. Then the 7th month of the year is the holiest month in the Jewish calendar. That includes the Day of Atonement, so it's the release from sin. Then the year of debt cancellation, the release from debt, and the Sabbath year for the land. And then the Jubilee was 7 times 7 years. So it's this repeated 1 in 7 pattern that God instituted from Genesis 2 onwards. So that's the biblical background. What are the important aspects to note about this institution? The key things to note are that it was pre-announced. So everyone knew that the year was coming every 7 years. And indeed, Deuteronomy even anticipates that lenders are going to be more and more reluctant to lend if the year of debt cancellation approaches. So everyone knew that this was going to happen. It applied only to the people of God, as I said, not to foreigners. So therefore we have to think carefully as Christians when we're applying this outside the church. Is it a wise thing to do given a wider secular society? It is linked to the promise of poverty relief. So I didn't read on in Deuteronomy 15, but a few verses later, there is a distinct promise that there would be no poor in the land. And that seems to be clearly linked to debt cancellation. And so throughout history, we see that mounting debts and the foreclosure on mortgages and land has been used as the way poverty is entrenched, debt slavery is perpetuated intergenerationally. And it's interesting that the one time that is referred to in the New Testament is Acts 4, where in the early church, there was no poor among them. It's linked to that Deuteronomy 15 institution. But perhaps the most important spiritual application, and where the idea of debt forgiveness is repeated often in the New Testament, is that of our debt of sin before God, and that is cancelled on the cross through faith in Christ's death for us. And that's explicitly stated in Colossians 2, 13 and 14. So what were the implications of this institution at the time? This would have meant that loans would, along with the ban on interest, would have meant that loans would not have been for monetary gain, would have been for charitable relief. Security could be taken on those interest-free loans, and perhaps the use of that security might have provided a return to the creditor. But this institution and the ban on interest would have forced lending to be charitable. It also means that debts could not circulate as money, because debts would be cancelled periodically, and therefore that they're not a long-term store of value that generally money needs to be. Nearly all of our money now that circulates is a debt of either the government or a bank. So in such a system could not exist if debts were being cancelled. As I said before, debt could not be used as a way to entrench long-term and intergenerational poverty. And these two institutions, debt cancellation and interest ban, would have forced financial capital into alternative contracts. If you wanted a return on your savings, they would have gone into rental assets, leasing, or investment in business contracts. Now, just a bit of context. Up until relatively recently, biblical commentators thought that both the year of debt cancellation and the jubilee were economically naive and would probably never have been applied. However, because we've rediscovered or discovered Babylonian and Sumerian records and understood how to translate them properly relatively recently, we now realize that the year of debt cancellation wasn't this strange idea that arises in the Mosaic Code and has no precedent. Rather, debt cancellations were quite frequently applied by Sumerian and Babylonian kings and emperors in the period before and through the time the Mosaic Code was written. And so what used to happen was that a new king would come onto the throne, and often they would abolish or cancel the debts, particularly those debts owed to the state, even some private debts sometimes, for various reasons, particularly to try and stop the accumulation of power by a landed aristocracy. The thing to note, however, is that nobody knew beforehand that debts were going to be cancelled. So this was, as I put there in the slide, it's an ex post institution. There were further attempts at debt cancellation in some of the Greek city-states, and in 4th century BC, Solon became Archon of Athens and instituted a debt cancellation to relieve the misery of indebted peasants. And similar institutions were also applied in early Roman times and under certain later emperors, particularly Marcus Aurelius and Hadrian. And then particularly in the early Byzantine Empire, debt cancellations were relatively frequent. They were a way to relieve the working landed laborers from debts to the aristocracy. And it was a way to stop a few coming to own the vast majority of land and also take most of the share of people's labor. But a good source for information on this is a recent book by Michael Hudson called Forgive Them Their Debts, where he goes through these ancient institutions. So that's just background to show that debt cancellation is not a novel or impossible idea. It was done before and after the Mosaic Code was written. Very briefly on what is currently being proposed for debt relief. Some of these ideas were there before the lockdown, recession, depression that has arisen in the past year, but they've been given added impetus by this. There are moves, there have been moves for debt relief by the World Bank last year for highly indebted poorer countries. That sort of reprises some of the debt relief that's occurred over the last 15 years for many of those same countries after the G7 initiative that began in 2005, pressured by the Jubilee debt campaign and others. In the US, a particular focus has been on the relief of student debt, and there have been proposals by senators to relieve $50,000 of student debt for the lower paid students. Most student debt in the US is now owed to the federal government. So that wouldn't involve banks or other private creditors being involved. The Biden administration is looking into that, but it's quite difficult to do legally. In the UK, a coalition of churches has sort of organised to campaign for £5 billion of debt relief for the poorest households, particularly through council tax, and utility bill arrears. And even prior to that, an academic at London University called Joanna Montgomery was advocating a structural sort of cancellation of debts, of household debts in the UK. For companies, the IMF and various think tanks have been talking about the need for the most indebted companies to have their debts cut, primarily through an expedited bankruptcy process. Prior to this crisis, roughly 20% of US corporates were thought to be what are called debt zombies. That is, they can't afford even to finance their debts, let alone invest for the future. And governments have been borrowing heavily through this crisis, and there have been ideas floated by economists and the Italian government, unsurprisingly, for the European Central Bank to cancel the debts that the government bonds that it's bought as a result of the crisis. And that's been opposed by the ECB, but is in circulation. So how, in the light of this sort of biblical precedent for debt cancellation, should we react to these various calls for debt relief? There are clear advantages from many of these proposals, particularly where debts have been accumulated by the poorest households, generally through no fault of their own. Unemployment has risen, they've had pay cuts as a result of furlough or whatever, and debt relief could be targeted at the poorest quite effectively. If that is done carefully, this could be revenue positive for government if it meant that poorer households did not become homeless, did not need to be housed as a result on the welfare budget. There is, in the US, sort of a relatively clear link now between the indebtedness of younger households, particularly through student debt, and their unwillingness to form households, get married, have children. Debt is leading to the postponement of the milestones that one would expect for household formation. And so part of the falling birth rate in many Western countries, higher income countries, is partly the result of high indebtedness amongst younger people. On the corporate side, it's been relatively clear over the last decade that one of the problems has been that as companies have got more and more indebted, they've become less keen to invest, but also because we haven't had a big shake-up of what are called zombie companies, they act to reduce prices for other companies, and they don't release resources where they could perhaps be better used. And so one of the reasons for the structural fall in productivity in higher income countries is likely to be the fact that we're keeping older, unprofitable companies still going on life support. If we expedited bankruptcy, those resources could be released quicker. And generally, if debt relief occurs, then both households and governments are more able to invest in the future, perhaps consume more and so on. So it's what we call curing the balance sheets. The more indebted the balance sheet is, the more vulnerable it is to shock, and the more need it has to retrench if interest rates rise, for instance. And for governments, there is the ongoing temptation that because most of their debt is in nominal terms, then the way they can relieve their debt burden is to allow inflation to explode. And so in the past, periods of hyperinflation have been sort of prompted by the need of government to get itself out of its debt problems. It couldn't finance its spending needs otherwise, than printing money and pulling an inflation surprise. So getting debt levels down reduces that temptation. However, this is not a simple process. For instance, obviously, every debt that's written off may be a gain for the borrower, but it's a loss for the creditor. Now, in many countries, the creditors are banks. Banks are highly leveraged balance sheets. And so if you impose large costs on banks, their capital is eroded, and they may go bust themselves, and they then need bailing out. And so you have to be very careful about if you are going to go down this route of cancelling debts, who are the creditors? Can they afford it? Will they then collapse? And that causes a domino effect throughout the financial system. So that's not saying you shouldn't do it. You just got to be aware that there are issues. Then there are moral hazard questions. So if I've indebted myself heavily and then get my borrowing cancelled, my debts cancelled, does this mean that I borrow heavily again in the future, or does it prompt other people to borrow heavily in the hope of their debts being cancelled? So there's a worry that debt cancellation could lead to the unwillingness of other debtors to fulfill their obligations. Then, because what we call ex post debt cancellations are a political process, there's this question of unfair allocation of gains and losses. So, for instance, in the US, if graduates all got a big gain because their debts were cancelled, those people who had faithfully paid their student loans off or chosen not to go to college because of the costs of borrowing would feel aggrieved because they've lost on both sides. They haven't gone to college, but they've seen others who have and got the benefits of that, having their debts cancelled. It's also clear that the key problem in the US is not, well, it's partly debt, but it's primarily the fact that there is rampant cost inflation in US college education. Cancelling debts does nothing to address that underlying problem. And then often there are legal constraints because if a government decides it's going to cancel debts, unless there are the debts owed to itself, then it's got to be very careful about the legal basis on which it does so. For instance, the idea that you can cancel some of the debts owed to the European Central Bank by other governments, I think would be in breach of the European Treaty and would likely face a successful challenge at the European Court of Justice. So how do we sort of balance these costs and benefits in the light of the biblical teaching? Well, it's first to say that nobody actually advocates a complete debt jubilee, the cancellation of all debts within any society, because, as I said, all our money now is a debt to another balance sheet, be it government or a bank. And so a debt jubilee, cancellation of bank deposits, for instance, leads to economic chaos. So nobody would say, yes, we institute the seventh year debt cancellation now. I think the most viable policy ideas are around expediting bankruptcy procedures. In legal traditions, bankruptcy is this balance between the need to meet your debt obligations on the one hand, and that being very important, with the need for debt relief on the other. And so personal bankruptcy is a way of sort of balancing those two biblical ideas of meeting obligations and giving debt relief when people are in desperate straits. And so it's perhaps the best way to relieve debt burdens is to adjust bankruptcy regimes when they need to. So, for instance, in the US, student debt is excluded from US personal bankruptcy. And so one of the sort of easiest ways to relieve that debt burden is by introducing student debt back into personal bankruptcy, and therefore if people become unemployed and desperate, they can relieve their student debt through that process. In the UK, Christians Against Poverty, a church charity that works with churches for giving debt advice, have advocated, for instance, an improvement to something called debt relief orders. That's a low-cost way in which poorer households can be helped to bring their debts together and reduce those through a negotiated process. Then I think we need to think much more carefully about reducing debt across our economies. At the moment, we encourage debt within our economies. Companies and banks are given tax breaks to manufacture debt and reduce equity. We need a much more principled approach to not just cancelling debt temporarily, but trying to de-lever, reduce debts across the piece. And as I said, Christians need to oppose debt as a principle. Often the advocates of debt relief they sound radical, but they're still willing to continue the current system. They just want to tweak it rather than systemically set our face against debt and seek other contractual terms. We've seen this particularly with lower income countries who enjoyed debt relief over the last 15 years after the Jubilee debt campaign was successful. They got $130 billion of debt relief. But over the last 10 years, many of those countries have just borrowed again, particularly from China. And the Chinese government have lent heavily into poorer country balance sheets, particularly to gain access to commodity and trade infrastructure. So now we've got a much more complex situation where the World Bank, the G7, may be wanting to relieve their debt, but don't want to if all it means is that their debt relief is used to pay the Chinese government. And so because we haven't opposed debt as in principle, we're in a much more complicated situation despite debt relief going on. So just to conclude, two big points are that there is far greater wisdom in the Old Testament law than we previously realized. Its debt cancellation was one, what we call ex ante, that is, it was announced beforehand. It's on a regular cycle. Both parties to a debt know when it's going to happen. The precedents at the time were ex post, that is, they come as a surprise. A king comes to the throne and cancels some debts. And so there's uncertainty generated. So this idea of a regular cycle is actually incredibly wise. But we need to raise this concern that debt serfdom, that debt slavery that the Old Testament was so keen to avoid, is re-emerging to enslave the poor and the young, particularly in higher income countries. And so we need to do much more to both debt relief for the poor now, particularly through better personal bankruptcy and debt cancelling, but we need to have this principle sort of ideal that debt is not how we should be financing tertiary education or house purchase. We need to move to different arrangements, different contracts to stop this indebtedness of the poor and the young. Now, just to maybe for question and answers, the big question for the decade ahead coming out of the virus is that government debts have exploded relative to the size of the economy. I think the US government deficit this year could be in the region of 20% of GDP. It's never borrowed that much, even in wartime. And so debts across Western governments are rising rapidly relative to the size of their economies, helped by central bank money printing. At the moment, we're starting to see the first signs of inflation beginning to pick up as a result. And the question is, are governments actually going to be forced to allow this to take off because their debts are too big to sustain without this sort of debt relief from inflation that's coming? This is the fear that's in financial markets. And I see that stock markets are down quite a lot today just because of this concern. So I'll just leave you with this scary chart of total debt to GDP in the world. I think to Q1 2021, we've now got to around $280 trillion of debt, and that in the red line has leapt to a much higher proportion of global GDP, over 350% of global GDP as a result of the crisis. Can we sustain this without those debts being restructured or without inflation?